Welcome to 10-Minute Tuesdays, EduPlanet 21's conversations with educational experts. Today, Bea McGarvey is back with me, and we had a great conversation about mass customized learning and specifically about shifting the mindset. Bea, welcome back.
Good to see you again, Claire.
So for anybody who didn't listen to our first conversation, can you begin by telling our audience a little bit about you and the MCL Institute?
Sure. I'm co-author with Chuck Schwan of a book entitled Inevitable Mass Customized Learning, which has resonated with a lot of educators. I've been a teacher elementary, I've been an administrator at the district and school levels, and I've consulted with schools around the country. And Chuck and I wrote this book as a way to stir people to be thinking outside of the 1892 box of industrial age schools where we find ourselves.
Great. So as I said at the beginning, last time we talked about some of the topics in your Shifting the Mindset series. And today I'd like to focus a little bit on the next series in your group of learning paths on viable learning outcomes.
Yes.
So I think a great place to start is, can you define the word viable for us?
Yeah, viable means that the learning outcomes that we've identified are doable in the period of time that we have the learner. So the challenge now for us is every content organization has written standards. And I think it was Bob Marzano a number of years ago kind of did this very informal study that if you took all of those standards and you looked at all the benchmarks under it, in order to even just cover those, you would have to change schools from K-12 to K-22. So, I mean, there's just way too much content. I mean, it's just, so we just have to stop it. We just have to stop it. And so viable means that we're looking at learning outcomes in a way that we can actually handle them in the period of time that we have the learners. So the first thing that's a little bit different is that we don't start from existing content. We want to look toward the future. Oftentimes we call these future-focused outcomes. So again, this vision is not about doing things like we've always done it. We buy Scott Forsman's, K-12 social studies curriculum. No. Instead, what we're going to say is, okay, what do these kids need for the 21st century? What are they going to find themselves? In what roles will they live? So we start there and we say, what are the life roles that kids will be finding themselves in? And so then what are the concepts, what are the skills, and what are the habits that they will need to be successful? So that's the first step. So in viable learning outcomes, there are kind of two chunks or two pieces. One is articulating them. Okay, so, and the next then is to organize them in such a way that facilitates learning, facilitates so that kids can go at their own pace, and facilitates that we can give kids feedback on their progression of learning. So those are the two big chunks of it.
When you talk about viable learning outcomes, how do they relate to the Common Core?
Yeah. That's really a good question. A lot of people, because we have this huge pressure from the Common Core. And the challenge is the Common Core, again, were a whole bunch of people that came together. And the way I look at it is sometimes it feels as if they put everything but the kitchen sink in there instead of narrowing the focus. The challenge for me also with the Common Core is that what they did is they cemented an industrial age structure. They put the knowledge and said, this is third grade. My flip response to that is that was just made up. Whoever said this was third grade math, someone just made that up at some point. So we go, okay, let's just say it's just math. And so let's write this. I mean, I think that the Common Core can help us to write them, but let's not put them into segmented age-based groups, which is hearkening back to 1892. Instead, let's just write them in progressions and look at this little guy and say, well, here's where you are in the progression of this particular, content or learning outcome. This is where you are now. And this is where you are now. So it's about formative feedback and in a progression of his or her learning. It's a very different way to organize and look at outcomes, but it's freeing when you do it because it takes away a lot of the old structures that have tied our hands.
For districts that you have worked with who have had success, how do they focus on the outcomes, but still have their students be successful in mandated state testing.
Yeah, so looking at those and creating or writing those viable learning outcomes is a hugely intensive, labor intensive process. So what has happened is oftentimes a number of school districts have come together to do that work together. So for instance, in Maine, there's the Maine cohort for customized learning, which is, gosh, a cohort of, I don't know, 20 plus learning communities. And so they've come together to actually write these in a progression. So they bring in, learning facilitators from the various communities to wrestle with what math looks like. So once they do that, once they have those, and it's interesting because they actually then kind of organize them into content, complex reasoning process, and habits of mind. When they're designing learning, they take whatever the content is, whatever the complex reasoning process, because that's processing the knowledge, and the habit of mind that they want the learner to be practicing. And that's what then creates a learning activity or a unit of instruction, to use kind of an old phrase. But the work of viable learning outcomes, that particular series, is all about how do we first just write these. How do we write them? How do we get them? How do we articulate them? And then how do we organize them so that then we can go the next step, which you're talking about, which is in terms of creating those learning opportunities.
You share with us maybe a success story or two of a learning community you've worked with who has done this successfully?
Sometimes people think it's a little bit easier at the elementary level to kind of do some things. It gets more difficult at the secondary level. So let me share a story of a high school. And these were two algebra teachers in a high school here in Maine. So here's the requirement, though. And I want people to hear this. These two really excellent teachers. So you can't just start doing things. The basis of this is you're assuming quality instruction, because you're not quality instruction. No matter what you do is going to fall apart. So what these two did is what I described actually in our previous interview, is that they created flipped lessons for algebra. So they broke it down so that kids could go through these at their own pace. And they created lessons where you'd see teams of learners kind of working through the learning outcomes. And what happened is the kids were so motivated that they ended up assigning summer school to themselves, because they wanted, they went to the teachers at the end of the school year and said, we'd like to kind of continue with this, but, you're not going to be here. So could we just continue working on this at home? And the teachers at the time were going, okay. Who are you and what did you do with our kids? And then they said, but the challenge is that when we get stuck, if we can't figure things out, we go to the teacher table. And so if we knew you were going to be here every Tuesday, we would just come in. So the teachers did that.
Talked a little bit about what's in the Viable Learning Outcomes Learning Path series. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
So I mentioned that they're kind of there are actually 3 learning paths in that series. One is articulating learning outcomes, one is organizing, but before that, there's one that's called background knowledge. Because in order for us to really do a good job with identifying learning outcomes, we have to understand knowledge, 2 types of knowledge, declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. And that gets technical, but here's what I say, as teachers, we're technicians. And we have to know the difference, because how you learn declarative knowledge is very different than how you learn procedural knowledge. So as a teacher, I need to know that, because I have to figure out, are you struggling with the declarative concepts, or is it actually the algorithm or the steps or the process? Because that then determines how I'm going to do interventions. It's another one of those foundational series that is a springboard for everything else to happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending some more time with me today. And I look forward to working with you and having future conversations with you.
Great. I do as well. Thank you.